economy. Do you think it forces you to also do things which are a little bit celebrity-like?
Absolutely. I mean, it certainly challenges us. For one, Lynn, for example, did a little bit of a jig in my own campaign. I haven't had the temerity to impose my singing, for example, on the public because I really can't sing. But a bit of a jig was quite helpful. I think that it's a way of finding connection with the people and being able to communicate with them, given the reality of their daily life. We sit in Congress, and everything that comes to us is already processed and digested and summarized and so on and so forth. But for the average person, all of these policy sort of debates and policy issues is really not a part of their daily life. And so they live in a much rawer, in a much more less sort of refined world, and their reality is very, very different. And so that's why what would be unconventional in one world is really conventional in their world. And for us who are trying to communicate, it's our challenge to be able to go to their world and tell them in their language, in using their symbolism, using their syntax, what it is that we want to do for the country.
Do you see yourself as being a bit of a technocrat, perhaps, in your approach?
I think so. I like to think and organize and plan and see the connections. I think before I open my mouth, that has kept me in good stead. My training was that of a businessman, a banker in New York, and those skill sets have helped me in this new endeavor, in this new field that I've entered. It's really, you know, deal making is really being able to show various publics or various interested entities in a business deal, for example, why it's in their interest to come together and to work together. And that pretty much is also what government work is like in passing legislation, for example, showing that this is really in the broader interest, that this is how we ought to move the country forward, and really trying to obtain a buy-in from all of these other parties who are interested in this matter.
You mentioned your period in the US also, where you were doing investment banking, really, a lot of private equity and so on. You didn't think of a political career at that point, did you? And in some ways, I suppose some people would say that you're a politician, a reluctant politician. You came in, perhaps not with that as being your first intention.
No, it was not. I really did not want to be in politics. I was happy in the private sector. And the idea was, I always wanted to do something for my country. The opportunity came when I was 35. And so I said, well, why don't I give this a chance? And by 40, if I really don't like it, I'm still young enough to go back. But as I told you, I was able to pass that law that made the education budget more fairly and equitably distributed all across the country. And it gave me a great deal of satisfaction. I said, this is what I want to do. This is where I want to exert myself. This is how I want to make my mark. To be successful is one thing, but to be significant is another. And this is how I can make a contribution to my country. And it's to that end that I dedicated myself now over the last decade or so.
Well, you come from a very illustrious political family. Does that put a certain amount of weight or obligation in your career?
I don't think so. I don't feel it so palpably as others might imagine. There is a sense, even growing up, there is a sense of giving back to my country. They've been very, very gracious to my family. You know? They elected my grandfather president, my father senator. And so there is this sense growing up of not just being for yourself, but at some point in your life, giving back to your country. So my life plan was always make a ton-load of money, and then at some age, you know, do something for the government or do something for the country. But that time came in 1993, and so when I ran, I said...
Had you made your ton-load of money already?
So maybe not just a kilo full. I had reached a point where I said, well, why don't I take a look at this? And it was really one foot in, one foot out. But that sense of satisfaction in having attained that law, and as well as others that I had worked on subsequently, gave me a sense of having a much more meaningful, making a much more meaningful difference in people's lives. And the rate of return on that is so much more fulfilling than in my previous life.
But given your background, somebody looking from outside might say, well, this person is a very privileged person. You've never wanted for anything. You've had a wonderful education. In that sense, how much does Mar Roxas, the man, know about the ordinary life of ordinary Filipinos?
Well, that's a fair question, Lynn. I think that it's not so much where you start or what you start out with, it's what you do with it. And I know what it's like to be anticipating and expecting and being anxious to wait for that envelope that you've gotten your first job because it gives you affirmation. I know what it's like to be nervous that your company is going through turmoil and that you might lose your job. I know what it's like to be anxious that the bosses are somewhat political and so therefore you might not be on their good graces. So the emotions that one goes through is the same whether you are in X job or Y job. I know what it's like to have to pay your telephone bill and your CATV bill and so on and so forth. The numbers and the number of digits might be different, but the emotions and the anxiety and the sense of accomplishment is the same. And I think that is what drives me in wanting to make my experience the norm. It ought not to be the exception. It ought to be the norm, that if somebody has skill sets and somebody has some capital, whether that's his own energy or his intelligence or his own desire, that they are able to make their way through the world without government being an obstacle to their efforts, but government being an enabler so that, in fact, they can attain their highest and best potentials. And there's no greater satisfaction that I can receive than walking down the street and having somebody come up to you, a stranger come up to you and say, you know, thank you, I know that you were working on this and I now have a job, or I've now been able to make a down payment on my home, or I've now been able to obtain a loan for this little business that I've had.
What about aspirations for yourself, though? Would you then think that you could give even more back by being, say, running for presidency?
Lynn, that is 3 years away, and a lot can happen in 3 years. What I do know is that I want to have meaningful impact in my country's development. I want to help in any way that I can, particularly in education, particularly in husbanding the resources that come from the people and that oftentimes is frittered away by government. I want to make a difference in bringing my country to the 21st century, really, in modernizing it, so that we can be a much stronger country in and of ourselves, as well as a much better partner to the neighborhood here in Southeast Asia.
So you avoided my question earlier, though, but I'll come back to it.
You come back in 3 years.
Any inclinations in that direction, though?
Well, you know, Lynn, whether as running for president or running for senator again or going back to investment banking or being a private citizen, I'm really hopeful about the Philippines, and I want to make a contribution. I think that that's where a meaningful life can be found. And who knows what will happen in the next 2-3 years. Come back again in 2 years. I'll be happy to host you.
Well, then I'm afraid I cannot resist my very last question, and that is now, you will be turning 50 in a few months' time.
That's right.
Has your mother said to you that it's time for you to settle down and have a family?
She's given up. I do have a son whom I love very much. He's 13 years old, and we're happy, and I certainly will be looking forward to establishing a family when the time comes.
Senator, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.